The year 1943 marked a seismic rupture in the history of mechanized warfare.
A transition point where the iron fist of the German Wehrmacht began its slow, agonizing dissolution. For 4 years, the German soldier had operated under the nearly sacrosanct belief in their own technological and tactical supremacy. Their blitzkrieg doctrine was built upon the twin pillars of speed and overwhelming force. A precision-engineered methodology that valued the meticulous crack of the heavy-caliber cannon and the coordinated thrust of the Panzer Division. They had faced adversaries in Poland, France, and initially the Soviet Union, who were either ill-equipped, tactically rigid, or simply outmatched by the quality of German steel and optics. This profound arrogance, rooted in overwhelming success, led to a dangerous intellectual stagnation. The shock of reversal, when it finally manifested, was therefore not just a physical defeat on the field, but a total psychological collapse rooted in doctrinal irrelevance. Suddenly, across the scorched, freezing plains of the Eastern Front and the claustrophobic bocage of the West, the Wehrmacht encountered an array of armaments, many crude, some revolutionary, that were engineered specifically to defeat German methodologies. These weapons did not rely on the same meticulous precision. They relied on mass, speed, and the terrifying concept of overwhelming saturation. They were the tools of a relentless enemy, tools which stripped away the German soldier's confidence and instilled a creeping terror that lingered long after the smoke had cleared. The German military machine simply had no adequate answer for the sudden shift in the tempo and the texture of warfare that these 5 specific instruments of destruction introduced. The foremost symbol of this doctrinal shock remains the Soviet T-34 medium tank. When this vehicle first rolled into German engagement zones in 1941, it triggered immediate panic. But its mass deployment 2 years later signaled the permanent end of German armored superiority. The previous generation of Panzer crews had been accustomed to seeing their anti-tank rounds strike enemy vehicles with predictable, devastating effect. Now, they were staring across open fields at a low-slung, defiant silhouette that seemed almost impervious to their standard ordnance. The genius of the T-34 was not complexity, but radical simplicity married to a revolutionary defensive posture, sloped armor. Where German tanks presented vertical or near-vertical plates, inviting rounds to strike squarely, the T-34 presented hardened steel angled at 52 degrees. A standard German 50mm or even the short-barreled 75mm round fired from a Panzer. A standard German 50mm or even the short-barreled 75mm round fired from a Panzer III or IV would strike this slope, and instead of punching through, would often slide harmlessly away, leaving behind a jarring, high-pitched metallic screech and only a shallow scrape mark. The kinetic energy meant to pierce was diverted and dissipated. Panzer crews, bewildered and trapped within the confines of their own vehicles, watched in utter despair as the Soviet steel juggernaut, often covered in the grime and dried mud of the Russian steppe, continued its relentless advance. The T-34's broad tracks allowed it to chew effortlessly through the infamous Russian mud, the Rasputitsa, where heavier, more complex German designs often bogged down, leaving their supply lines strained and their operational speed halted. More critically, the T-34 was armed with the formidable 76.2mm cannon, which, even in its early iterations, outranged and outpenetrated the standard German tank guns they typically faced. The sight of the muzzle flash from the Soviet behemoth meant German crews were now facing incoming fire from distances where their own guns were effectively harmless. This psychological dislocation, the feeling of being hunted by an unstoppable force that could not be adequately addressed, led directly to the desperate measures taken by the German High Command, including the crash development of the Panther tank. But until the Panther, and later the Tiger, were available in significant numbers, the T-34 remained the undisputed master of the battlefield, a constant rolling reminder that the era of the quick German armored victory was over. The very texture of the steel, cold, wide, and angled, represented the overwhelming industrial mass of the Soviet war machine, a force that simply did not break under conventional fire. Simultaneously, a very different kind of technological terror was manifesting on the Western Front, subtly altering the fundamental rhythm of infantry engagement, the American M1 Garand rifle. The doctrine of the German infantry squad centered around the sustained, heavy volume of fire delivered by the MG-42 machine gun, supported by the deliberate, precise shots of the Kar-98K bolt-action rifle. The K-98K was a fine weapon, robust and accurate, but it demanded a rhythmic pause between every shot. The German soldier would fire, hear the sharp report, and then the deep, metallic thunk-clack, as the heavy bolt was manipulated, extracting the spent cartridge and seating a new round. This created a recognizable, slower cadence in the firefight, a predictable, almost stately rhythm to the aggression. The M1 Garand instantly changed the soundscape of the war. It delivered an 8-round torrent of semi-automatic fire, one pull of the trigger, one round expelled, until the clip was empty. The sound was not the deliberate crack and pause of the bolt action. It was a continuous metallic drumming, a relentless downpour of lead. An American squad equipped with M1s could put out several times the sustained firepower of an equivalent German squad, relying on the K-98K, pinning down entrenched positions with a density of fire that bordered on machine gun levels. German squads, used to utilizing the predictable pause between enemy shots to reposition or raise their heads to target, found themselves pinned indefinitely. The sheer volume of incoming rounds made any movement a death sentence. The sensory effect was overwhelming. Instead of isolated shots, the air was suddenly thick with the sound of incoming fire, creating a continuous, terrifying acoustic wall. The smell of hot cordite was constant. The German soldier realized that the enemy, unlike previous opponents, was never resting, never pausing for breath. The weight of sustained, immediate aggression shifted the initiative entirely to the American side. Yet, perhaps the most infamous sensory signature of the M1 was its moment of necessary vulnerability, which became almost a battlefield myth: the high-pitched metallic ping. When the 8-round en-bloc clip was expended, the empty clip was violently ejected, creating a distinctive, sharp auditory signal.
For the pinned German soldier, this ping represented the only moment of potential respite, a fleeting instant of vulnerability.
As the American soldier reached for a fresh clip, desperate German infantry often risked exposure based on this single sound cue. However, the reload time was milliseconds, and the torrent would instantly resume, often leaving the German soldier caught in the transition, proving that even this tiny moment of hope was unreliable and rapidly punished. The Garand thus introduced a level of unrelenting, sustained pressure that the Wehrmacht's infantry doctrine, built around the efficiency of the bolt and the supremacy of the machine gun, was utterly unable to counteract effectively at the individual level. If the T-34 was the site of armored despair, and the M1 Garand the sound of relentless infantry pressure, then the Soviet Katyusha rocket launcher was the sheer, shattering roar of industrial mass murder. A weapon that dissolved defensive positions through area saturation and psychological terror. Known derisively by the Germans as Stalin's organ,
due to the appearance of its launch racks and the raw, guttural screech it produced.
The Katyusha was the antithesis of German artillery doctrine. German heavy guns were masterpieces of optical precision, built for methodical, targeted destruction. The Katyusha, crudely mounted onto the bed of a Zeiss truck or even makeshift tractor chassis, was built for speed, volume, and absolute devastation across a wide area. The auditory experience of a Katyusha barrage remains one of the most terrifying descriptions from the Eastern Front. It did not sound like standard artillery, the clean, concussive crack of a shell leaving the barrel. Instead, the firing sequence began with a series of mechanical clicks, and then erupted into a raw, tearing sound, a collective metallic shriek. As a fan of unguided rockets, sometimes 48 at once, accelerated rapidly toward the target zone. The sound was so distinct, so unnerving, that veterans claimed they could distinguish the Katyusha launch signature from anything else in the lore. It was the sound of fabric ripping, magnified to the power of a tempest. The visual spectacle was equally horrific. Unlike artillery shells, which fall on a parabola, the rockets streaked across the sky, leaving fiery, smoky trails, creating an immediate, overwhelming sense of danger. Upon impact, the destructive force was not localized penetration, but massive area saturation. Within seconds, a square kilometer could be utterly smothered in high explosive fury. The rockets detonated across the landscape, not merely shattering structures, but pulverizing the earth. After the barrage, the atmosphere was thick with the stench of burnt explosive, unspent fuel residue, and the heavy, metallic odor of pulverized concrete and soil.
What had been an entrenched strong point, a village, a field headquarters, or a fortified tree line, was transformed into a smoking moonscape.
A violently churned crater field where no man or material could survive intact. The psychological impact was immediate and irreversible. Entire divisions reported having their combat effectiveness reduced to zero simply by surviving a Katyusha bombardment. Even before the infantry engaged, the weapon shattered morale by rendering the fundamental concept of entrenched safety obsolete.
The Germans had no immediate countermeasure, as the truck-mounted launchers were highly mobile, firing their load in seconds and vanishing before counter-battery fire could zero in,
leaving the Wehrmacht to wrestle with the demoralizing knowledge that at any moment the sky could suddenly erupt into a firestorm of terrifying, uncounterable noise and destruction. While the ground war raged with new levels of mechanized and acoustic horror, the war in the air underwent an equally radical transformation, stripping the German ground forces of their protective canopy. The introduction and mass deployment of the sleek, silver P-51 Mustang long-range fighter redefined aerial supremacy, and, critically, strangled the logistical arteries of the Wehrmacht. Before the P-51, the American and British daylight bombing campaigns relied on short-range escorts, meaning the heavy bomber formations were vulnerable to deadly German interception deep inside enemy territory. The P-51 changed this equation fundamentally. Equipped with the revolutionary British Rolls-Royce Merlin engine, the Mustang possessed exceptional speed and, more importantly, unprecedented range. It could fly to Berlin and back, accompanying bombers the entire route, forcing the Luftwaffe to engage on Allied terms or suffer devastating bomber losses unprotected. The psychological effect on the German ground troops was profound. For years, they had relied on the Luftschirm, air screen, provided by the Luftwaffe, a confidence reinforced by the sight of their own fighters patrolling above. Now, the sky belonged to the Allies. The P-51 became a spectral threat, appearing suddenly and without warning, its powerful engine roar signaling immediate danger. The Mustangs were not content merely to escort bombers. They became aggressive aerial hunters.
Descending from high altitude, their silver fuselages catching the sunlight, they would seek out and destroy anything moving on the roads below. The sudden sight of a P-51 diving toward a column meant the immediate, panicked dispersion of troops and vehicles. Strafe runs delivered devastating precision, the rapid metallic hammer of the .50 caliber machine guns tearing through the thin plating of transport trucks, turning fuel tanks into sudden balls of fire and scattering convoys of desperate troop reinforcements. The P-51's true strategic nightmare lay in logistical strangulation. By operating hundreds of miles behind the front lines, the Mustangs severed vital supply chains. Railway marshalling yards were reduced to twisted spaghetti of track and burning freight cars. Oil depots flared into infernos, the smell of burning aviation fuel carrying for miles across the German countryside. Troop movements, essential for reinforcing crumbling fronts, slowed to a crawl, forced to travel only by night or in small, concealed groups. For the German soldier on the Eastern or Western Front, the P-51 represented the loss of safety and the end of mobility. Every road, every open field, every railway siding became a killing zone. They felt exposed, hunted not just by the enemy in front of them, but by the watchful, silent hunters high above, waiting to plunge down and deliver sudden, devastating accuracy. This operational reality fatally hampered the Wehrmacht's ability to reinforce, resupply, and retreat, turning strategic defense into a slow, inevitable logistical collapse.
Finally, the shift in warfare tempo reached its ultimate intimacy with the introduction of the American M1A1 rocket launcher, better known by its nickname, the bazooka.
This weapon shattered the remaining security offered by thick tank plating and transformed the battlefield dynamic. From long-range artillery duels to close-quarters, highly personal assassinations of armored vehicles. Before the bazooka, infantry fighting armor was a desperate asymmetric struggle, often relying on clumsy magnetic mines, close-quarters satchel charges, or the slow deployment of heavy anti-tank cannons. The bazooka was a revelation, a simple open steel tube, shoulder-fired, designed to launch a high-explosive anti-tank rocket. The genius of the heat principle was that it disregarded the thickness of the steel armor plate. Instead of relying on kinetic energy to punch through, the shaped charge focused a cone of explosive force, creating a hyper-velocity jet of molten copper and superheated gas. This jet would pierce the armor instantly, often leaving a surprisingly small entry wound, but delivering utter chaos inside the tank. The setting where the bazooka achieved its most devastating psychological effect was the claustrophobic chaos of the Normandy hedgerows, the bocage.
In this maze of sunken lanes and earthen banks, German armor could not utilize its speed and range.
Instead, they were forced into close quarters, where highly mobile, concealed two-man bazooka teams lay in wait. The experience for the German tank crew was one of sudden, blinding terror. They might hear a fleeting whisper of movement in the dense foliage, followed by a sudden, ear-splitting roar and the immediate flash of orange light. The penetration was instantaneous. Inside the Panzer, the scene was one of rapid decompression and searing heat. The metal lining of the hull would shatter internally, spallation, sending deadly shrapnel flying alongside the jet of molten metal, vaporizing components, igniting hydraulic fluid, and burning flesh. The smell of burning insulation and burnt oil filled the interior, quickly followed by the desperate clamor of the crew attempting to bail out of the sudden inferno. The bazooka effectively dissolved the concept of safe, offensive armored maneuver. The German soldier realized that while a tank crew was protected from small arms fire and fragmentation, they were fundamentally vulnerable. To an enemy soldier hiding 300 feet away, armed with a lightweight tube, This forced the Wehrmacht to divert precious infantry assets into highly restrictive close support roles, accompanying every tank in the hedgerows, a tactical necessity.
That slowed the armored thrusts to a crawl, neutralized the speed advantage of the panzers, and constantly exposed infantry to the heavy fire of the opposing forces. The bazooka was the close-up manifestation of the technological answer to German armor, turning the once mighty steel beasts into vulnerable, mobile tombs. The collective impact of these 5 weapons, the T-34, M1 Garand, Katyusha, P-51 Mustang, and bazooka, was greater than the sum of their parts. They represented the irreversible end of the age of German technological superiority and tactical confidence. The T-34 introduced the nightmare of uncounterable armor and mass production.
The M1 Garand altered the very acoustic tempo of the infantry battle, substituting precision for unrelenting aggression.
The Katyusha destroyed the concept of safety through sheer, demoralizing area saturation.
The P-51 choked the logistical spine of the war machine from the air.
The bazooka delivered the final, fatal blow to the security of the armored soldier in the intimate chaos of the close-range battlefield.
What the German soldier faced in the latter half of the war was not merely a defeat of doctrine, but a defeat of sensory confidence.
They could no longer trust their anti-tank rounds to penetrate, their defensive positions to hold, or their skies to be friendly.
They could no longer trust their armor to protect them from a hidden foe. The war became loud, fast, and overwhelmingly relentless, a relentless surge of sound and steel
that they were never trained nor equipped to counter.
The steady confidence of the early war years eroded into a constant, lingering fear of the noise.
The noise announced a terror for which they had no ready reply.
This psychological breakdown, hastened by the ingenuity of these 5 key weapons, cemented the fate of the disciplined, yet rigid, Wehrmacht.